Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Entertainment Weekly has spotlighted Heather Terrell, writing under the pseudonym Marie Benedict, as an author who likes shedding light on women whose achievements have often languished in the shadows of history. She's given voice to everyone from Hedy Lamarr to Agatha Christie. Boldness she's displayed on the page since early works like The Other Einstein, Carnegie's Maid, where the library journal assured readers that with its well-drawn characters, good pacing, and excellent sense of timing and place, this volume should charm lovers of historicals, romance, and the Civil War period. With her next bestseller, The Only Woman in the Room, the New York Times would declare that her career was made with a ready-made thriller as well as a feminist parable, with Marie Claire magazine further crowning it as one of the best in women's fiction of 2019, while Newsweek observed with works like this and others, like Audible exclusive Agent 355 and Smoke Signal, co-written with Kate Quinn, that in writing her narratively connected, fictionalized biographies, Benedict is not unlike an archaeologist, digging up clues to moments of epiphany. The Washington Post hailed The Mystery of Miss Christie as a stunning story, while Good Morning America decreed The Personal Librarian, co-written with Victoria C. Murray, was historical fiction at its best, and People magazine celebrated Lady Clementine as a fascinating fictionalized account, and USA Today featured it as among the week's hottest new book releases. Meanwhile, the Financial Times mused over hidden genius that Marie Benedict brings human warmth and in-depth science to a novel of the life of Rosalind Franklin, with a humanly as well as scientifically engaging read, and Town and Country magazine spotlighted her latest, The Mitford Affair, as a fun, compelling, and deliciously mannered saga. Her prolific catalog, writing under Heather Terrell, additionally features the Mara Coin series, with the Chrysalis and the Map Thief, Bridge of Kildare, the Fallen Angel duology with Fallen Angel and Eternity, and the Book of Eva duology with Relic and Boundary, and the upcoming in all her splendor is Marie Benedict, with translations in 29 languages around the world. She's here today to talk about her life in literature. Welcome to the show. Now, we understand it's fair to say books were your buddies growing up.
I think it all started with reading. I was a voracious, very early reader. My parents tell me that I literally could read as early as 2. And my very first memory of involving other people in that type of storytelling was when I was 4. And I don't think I've ever told anybody this story, not for a long time. I was in kindergarten. And, then you didn't have to be 5 to be in kindergarten. And my teacher was out sick. It was one of our first days of school. And actually, she ended up not being in school for the whole year. And we were in the library. It was a whole bunch of, kindergarten kids. And we were left alone, which is odd thinking back on it. And I picked up a book and I sat on a table. And I held it up and I read it to my classmates. And I will never forget, I don't have a lot of childhood memories, but this one is emblazoned in my mind. I remember seeing in the doorway the librarian and the substitute teacher, who obviously she was just going to get, just their mouths dropped as I had kind of assumed this role of storyteller for the class. It wasn't a story I'd written, obviously. It was a book, children's book, but I remember that moment so well and remember looking at the faces of my classmates as they were just so engaged in the story. So that's probably my very first memory of storytelling.
Sounds like a wonderful one, and that it intrigued you to have a listening audience as you told your story. Was that a precursor of things to come?
What's funny about that is that, yes, I guess in that moment, but I never, after that point, engaged in storytelling, right? I never wanted to be a writer. I didn't really perform, which is kind of another type of storytelling. It wasn't until I was much, much later and, past that law career that took forever, that I kind of went full circle. I was just always a reader. From a very young age, I always had my nose in a book. And so storytelling for me was more about me being immersed rather than immersing other people.
History really became your passion thereafter, graduating magna cum laude from Boston College with a major in that very subject along with art history, before then earning your JD from Boston University School of Law. When did you first find your window into connecting that love of history with a story you specifically wanted to tell on the page, and what became the Chrysalis, a dual timeline story set back in the 17th century and present day, starring Mara Coin?
As I mentioned, I never thought I'd be a writer, right? I never aspired to that. I never had, if you've talked to a million writers, so many writers always wanted to write. They were scribbling stories when they were children, typing them when they were older. That was never me. I always loved history, and I loved like the unknown bits and pieces and voices in history. I was a history major in college, and I got swept up in being a lawyer, which happens when you're a history major. And when I was a lawyer, I knew it wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. I still kind of felt the kind of lure of that love of history, but I was trying to find a way to marry the two. And that wasn't happening at my enormous New York City law firms. But one day a friend of mine asked me a question. She asked me, a very dear friend of mine, if there would ever be a case I would refuse to take on moral grounds, even though my client had an excellent legal position. Now, at that time, I worked at a behemoth law firm. So I was representing huge Fortune 500 companies in commercial disputes, securities, law, all that type of stuff. And I didn't have an answer to her question right away, but in the, I want to say weeks or months that followed, I was reading some law journal article, and it recounted the very first few cases in which families of Holocaust victims, this was in the early 90s, families of Holocaust victims were trying to recoup artwork that had been stolen from them by the Nazis during World War II. Now, we know about that now, right? That's something that's surfaced. There's movies, there's books, but this was like the very first time this was reaching any sort of audience. And I became just fascinated. It was one of the first times I'd really seen history and the law come together. And so I went down my very first huge rabbit hole, learning about these stories and these cases and these families. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, one day I had an answer to my friend's question, and I had a whole story, a whole book just appeared to me. And it was about someone like me being asked to represent the kind of client that I would have been asked to represent: a large museum, a large auction house, someone who had the funds for my large law firm, to represent them in keeping the artwork from the family. And because the law at that time, and it has changed since, the law at that time would have favored the museum or the collector or the auction house. It would not have favored the family. And all of a sudden I had a story. And I kind of chipped away at that. I didn't tell anybody for like 8 years while I was practicing law. Like you said, I was, I worked crazy long days. If I had a free hour or I was waiting for someone to get back to me, I would kind of work on it. I had zero idea what I was doing, like no idea what I was doing. And that is the book that eventually became the Chrysalis over time.
Once you were done, what was the most important celebration for you, knowing it was heading out into the world?
I honestly could not believe that someone wanted to not only thought my story was good enough, right, but they wanted to share it with others. But yeah, there was definitely that moment when my agent called me and said, you have a contract. But, it happens before that. It happens in the writing world, as I'm sure you know, when you get an agent, because it's almost as hard to get a literary agent as it is to get published. Not totally, but close. And when my agent agreed to take me on, I was like, really? You really will? And when I look back at that moment, that was a real leap of faith and trust on her part, because what she was reading was far from the book that it would become, and like light years away from, what I do now. So, but yeah, that was a huge moment.
With the freedom to head just about anywhere on the page, you next whisked readers off to Beijing, China, circa 1421, at the height of the Ming Dynasty, then to Lisbon, Portugal in 1496, and up into the present day as Mara Coyne finds herself in New York fighting against the map thief. Please give us a look at how you wove this together all so seamlessly on the page.
Oh my gosh, we're really going back in time here. Speaking of going back, I think I've done it in a variety of ways. That first book, the Chrysalis, those historical storylines came second. There's 2 of them in there, and I layered them in later. With the map thief, it was different. And again, I was learning how to write a book. I was learning it on a deadline. I really didn't know what I was doing. I think I did part separately and part together, because there's a point at which the stories overlap, and this is often true with multiple storylines. There have to be points of contact and parallel. So you kind of need to know where those are. And so sometimes you'll have to break from one and go to the other.
You trekked all over the historical map from there, to 5th century Ireland and the Bridget of Kildare, then within the Fallen Angel duology over the self-titled debut and traveling to eternity in the sequel, then off to the Boundary Lands and the Book of Eva series, over Relic and Boundary where you were creating your own. How do you feel looking back that your writing journey from those first 7 books led you to the point where you were ready to transition from writing as Heather Terrell to Marie Benedict and the first-person historicals that would follow, telling the stories of so many important women?
You know, I kind of look at my Heather Terrell books, my first 7 books, almost as like writing exercises to learn how to write and what I wanted to write, what I was supposed to be writing in a way. The lead up to that book was me honing in on what I was supposed to be doing. But as I've had more experience and written a lot more books since then, I usually stay in one voice and then do the other voice. I find it, especially with the kind of writing I do now, which is first person, it's more intimate, more emotional. It's hard to put on a whole bunch of hats one right after the other. I'm better off staying in the character and then shifting. It was really a process. Those first 7 books in which I explored a similar theme, I'm looking at the untold pieces of history and I'm winnowing it down. The first 3 books are historical suspense, right? And the third book in those first 3, Bridget of Kildare is all about the women. And then I wrote 2 young adult series, again, exploring how history is made. And I'm doing it from a young adult perspective, which is first person, right? Which was new for me. So as I'm kind of going through this process, again, I kind of thought of it I didn't think of it at the time, but I look at it now. They were writing exercises, like me working through my skill set, trying to find what was the best fit, and also honing in on the theme that I felt most called to write about. And that kind of all circles back to when I was a kid and some interests I had. But I had kind of started to think about that theme, this theme of women specifically, going first person, really looking at an intimate view of their lives, their legacies, the issues that they're struggling with.
The Other Einstein would mark your debut and shift into focusing on real-life women protagonists whose importance in history had often, up to the point you told the story, been minimized. In that spirit, what first intrigued you so about the life and mind of Albert Einstein's first wife, Eva Marie, to create what Bustle promised was a story that takes you into her heart, mind, and study as she tries to forge a place for herself in a scientific world that is dominated by men?
I have kept for a really long time a list of historic women. I mean, I'm sure you're not surprised. There's no shortage of historic women whose stories deserve to be told. But I really landed on Mileva, Albert Einstein's first wife, and the other Einstein, when I was this was years ago, reading a children's biography of Albert Einstein with one of my sons. I have 2 now teenage boys. They were obviously much younger. And one of my sons has always, since he was in elementary school, wanted to be a physicist. My husband and I do not even know where this comes from. It's not from us. And so, dutiful mother that I am, I would read scientific biographies for kids. And in this one biography, there were about 2 or 3 sentences about Mileva. Something like, and I'm going to butcher this, but something like, they were talking about Albert's years at university and his struggle to actually get to university because it wasn't that easy. They said, there was this woman in his university physics program in Switzerland. Her name was Mileva. They sometimes worked on projects together. They got married. They were married during his most prolific period, and then they were divorced. And that was it. And I was like, wait a second. I mean, Albert Einstein, one of the most famous people of our 20th and the 20th century, most recognizable, most lauded, right? A physicist, was married to a physicist at a time when so few women were allowed to go to high school, let alone university. And even if they could get to university, so few colleges allowed women to be admitted into a physics program. Like, what are the odds? And why is this? Why? I'm no scientific scholar, but why have I never heard of this? Just seems so remarkable. And so I went down the rabbit hole and I learned that her story was not a footnote to his story. Her story was magnificent in its own right. That she had really risen up from the backwater of 19th century Serbia, where it was illegal to be in high school if you were a girl. to become one of the very first women in a university physics program. And, the contributions that she seemed to have made during this most prolific period, I was desperate to explore. And so that's kind of how it came to be. It was literally like 2 sentences in a kid's biography, but that were notable for what they didn't say, as opposed to what they actually said. And so often that's where I find the women is in the shadows, in the corners, in the offhand remark, in the lack of description.
How beautiful that those were all details waiting for you to bring into the light, which you successfully transitioned into doing full-time as Marie Benedict, where the New York Times spotlighted you thereafter as a writer of novels inspired by women whose achievements have been overlooked or underappreciated by history. You'd focus in that regard on Clara Kelly and Carnegie's Maid, which book lists congratulated as engaging, adding that the chaste romance will draw readers of inspirational fiction, while the novel is constructed to appeal to those seeking a tale with the upstairs-downstairs dynamic and all but invisible female characters, who are either the impetus for or actual originators of great men's great ideas, while the unforgettable Hedy Lamarr would star in The Only Woman in the Room, which Smithsonian Magazine singled out as one of their institution scholars' favorite books of 2019. What drew you to Hedy as the next real-life character that you wanted to give voice to on the page?
I always tell people, it's just about looking for them, wanting to find them. They will reveal themselves to you because they want to be found. Hedy, I had always known of Hedy Lamarr. My grandmother was like a huge Hedy Lamarr fan, so I was aware of her, which probably a lot of kids my age weren't. I knew she was this, truly stunning, kind of exotic beauty who'd been in all these famous movies in the 30s and 40s into the 50s. But I hadn't thought much of her, to be honest, beyond that, until one day an anthropologist friend just mentioned that Hedy Lamarr had been an inventor. I was just at lunch. And, as I said, I have a long list of women, and I kind of added her to that. And what normally happens is I'm like midway through one story and I'm like, I just need a break from it. So I'll go and research some of the other women on my list. And when I got to Hedy Lamarr and her story and her invention, my mind was blown. Her work as an actress and gossip fodder was the least interesting thing about her. That's what it seemed to me. I mean, her origin story of a Jewish refugee. First of all, she had to hide the fact that she was Jewish. You couldn't be Jewish and be a movie star in Hollywood, or at least not openly. Who was escaping a Nazi arms-dealing husband to come to the United States. And then, she's sort of a self-taught engineer, a tinkerer, wanted to come up with something to help in the war effort, and that thing was actually so revolutionary. It ultimately became Wi-Fi. When I learned all that, I was like, oh, my mind was blown.
So she essentially invented Wi-Fi.
Yes, she did. I mean, she came up with something that she had to patent it, which, so it had been vetted. It was a very workable system called a secret communication system. And its goal was to make torpedo warfare more effective at sea. It would allow the entity launching the torpedo to have a more precise target. At this time, which I didn't know, of course, until I did this research, torpedo warfare was horribly ineffective. Oftentimes the men on the ship launching the torpedo would get hurt, right? And that it didn't often hit the target. And she created this with a musician, George Antile, such an unlikely pair of inventors. And they offered it. They offered the patent to the Navy, and the Navy refused to utilize it. I mean, we don't know exactly why, but I write fiction. So I can imagine that if Hedy Lamarr strolled into your office and offered you a patent at that time, you would, it would be considered probably not worthy, because a woman couldn't be beautiful and brilliant, right? What could she make that would be useful, especially in a military capacity? I mean, come on. So yeah, but that wasn't the end of her invention. It wasn't the end of it. It was worked on over the years by various military scientists or contractors, and its final iteration was the foundation of Wi-Fi.
You next brought George Washington's spy, 18-year-old Elizabeth Morris, part of his top secret Culper ring, into the spotlight as one of America's first female spies. What an intriguing story this must have been to tell, based on true events in Agent 355.
It's interesting to me, as somebody who came to these books through my own process, my own, my writing of these books started, to be honest with you, in middle school. When I read The Mists of Avalon, which was, my aunt gave me that book, and, it's a retelling of the Arthurian legend from the perspective of the women. And so this quest to find the women and give them voice has been going on for a long time. And these books, wow, it's been beautiful to see how many writers have also written in this space. And it's wonderful to see all these women's stories being told, especially, and I know we'll get to it, but Black women. And that's something that's really starting. And I'm so proud to have been a part of that, with the sort of traditional historical fiction, but that's an aside. So Agent 355, I mean, to me, these women are everywhere. I mean, I just finished writing a book that'll come out next spring that goes back even farther in terms of historical women. So Agent 355, so we've always known that George Washington had something called I'm not going to pronounce Culpeper ring. I don't know if that's the right phrase for it. He had a spy ring. And it was really instrumental in ferreting out important information about the British and their doings and stopping them in their tracks. And in fact, what happened at West Point was really pivotal. And we know that he had at least one woman. Agent 355 in their code was a code for woman in the code language that they use. Nobody knows who she was. And so I kind of went back into the historical record and looked at the possibilities. And there's several to choose from. I mean, there's some other women who could have been Agent 355, but I kind of picked the person I thought was the most likely. And really, because I feel like her legacy, when we look at the past, we often think of historical women as so different from us, especially the further back we go, right? We think of those women as, just a different creature altogether. And yet the bravery and the tenacity of these historical women is so little known and so underrated. And so that was kind of my desire to celebrate that piece of history. The founding fathers are everywhere, but you know what? They were not alone, for sure.
The Los Angeles Times would muse of the mystery of Miss Christie that it's not a whodunit or even a whydunit, but a sort of how the hell did he do it? As Christie's first and best known detective, Hercule Poirot might say, patience, all will be revealed. Please do so if you would and shed some light for viewers on the 11 missing days in the legendary author's life in December in 1926. This was a case the media could not crack with round-the-clock coverage. What made you want to do it here?
Well, first of all, I come by my long-standing love of Agatha Christie. Honestly, that aunt that gave me that book, The Mists of Avalon, also gave me like every Agatha Christie novel, right? That aunt was an English poet, an English professor. She was a poet, and she was like a rebellious nun. And she was really the person who kept me in books. I was the oldest of 6 kids. It was no easy matter to keep me occupied in my reading. And so I'd always loved Agatha Christie, and I'd always loved that interwar time period. There was just something about it, the way, things weren't exactly black and white. There were so many different forces at play. It was modern and not modern. Anyway, so I realized that, and Agatha Christie, unlike a lot of the women I read about, is obviously known. Her name is synonymous with the golden age of detective mystery fiction, right? But I'd also discovered when I was doing some research that she had disappeared in circumstances that were like torn from the pages of one of her books. And the more I looked at that, the more I realized I didn't really know Agatha Christie. When I pictured her basically as like Miss Marple, right? Tweed outfit, little cup of tea, quietly anonymous in the background, solving mysteries, And so I wanted to find out who she was because, I'm fascinated with women who leave important legacies, right? Agatha Christie's legacy is enormous, huge, reverberates into today. So I went down the rabbit hole. That's what I love to do. And so I went down there with her and I took a look at this disappearance and I really looked at it. I went through, she never spoke about it again. She never spoke about it at all. Let's put it briefly in one interview. There's an autobiography of her, which I like pounced upon, not one mention of this pivotal event. But there's tons. It was, like you said, it was like a worldwide paparazzi event, really, the likes of which that hadn't been seen before. And it was also the first time when she disappeared. Her car was left running on the edge of a cliff. Her belongings were strewn about. She wasn't a household name at the time, but she was a young mother of a war hero. So there was so much for the media to latch on to in her story. And the more I looked, the more it seemed to be like the time period in which she disappeared, what happened in the years that followed, what happened leading up to it, who the person she was before and after the disappearance was really, it was really the answer to me to understanding how she came to be the Agatha Christie. Was the person that she went into this whole affair with was not the person who came out on the other side.
The Washington Post would rave that the ending is ingenious, and it's possible that Benedict has brought to life the most plausible explanation for why Christie disappeared for those 11 days in 1926. Cutting right to the chase, do you have a working theory on where Agatha actually vanished off to?
No one knows. I surmise, and this is born out of a feeling that a woman who was as masterful as she was, who created these unsolvable mysteries, she would not have been a victim in her own vanishing. I think these are all spoilers, leading up to her disappearance, her mother died, with whom she was extremely close, and her husband, Archibald Christie, wanted to leave her for another woman. And she was emotionally distraught, but I don't think it was like some kind of weird fugue state, like some people have speculated. Archie, at that time, a divorce was difficult. And you had to name, there had to be like a reason for it. And very often the husband would list like an extramarital affair or a peccadillo of some sort. Archie would not name his mistress as the problem. And at this time, she had a kind of an estranged relationship with her young daughter, Rosalind. And she was fearful that the divorce would be pinned on her by Archie as her fault. And yes, she was emotionally over, but I really do think it was her way, staging it, disappearing, I think was her way of making known whose fault the divorce really was. I don't think Agatha thought it would become the worldwide paparazzi event that it did. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes, was called in to help solve the case. I mean, nobody could find her. It was the first time planes had been used in a manhunt. I mean, it was just crazy. So I think things got way out of control, but I think she wanted to set the record straight and make clear to her daughter and anyone in their family who might be curious that she was not the one who caused the divorce, that she was doing everything that she could to keep the marriage together. And it was kind of her last ditch effort. What unspooled after that, I affected her terribly. It made her a very reclusive person afterwards, almost like a hermit in some ways, very gun shy in the years that followed. It really traumatized and changed her. But I think it was a carefully calculated method. And I think the person that came through on the other side, I think, was a person who had her own agency in her life. And I think she became the Agatha Christie.
Now, Good Morning America will call your collaboration with Victoria C. Murray historical fiction at its best within the pages of The Personal Librarian, which they added spins a complex tale of deceit and allegiance as told through books. Please walk us inside J.P. Morgan's Pierpont Morgan Library and introduce us to Bella DaCosta Green.
I actually came across Belle DaCosta Green decades ago. Okay, so for people who don't know the book is about J.P. Morgan's private librarian, Belle DaCosta Green. He built, because he had so many rare and priceless manuscripts, more Gutenberg Bibles than anyone in the world, each of which are now worth like $500 million. It's crazy. He couldn't fit it anywhere. So as you would if you were a very, very rich and wealthy person, you built your own library in Manhattan next to your mansion, right? So he built this structure and he realized he needed someone to help curate and run it. And he hired Belle, which was very unusual, of course, a woman during this time period at this peak, and she ran it for 4 decades. But I found out about her at a time when her role wasn't well known. or celebrated at the Morgan. When I was a lawyer, I think I mentioned I didn't exactly love my time as a lawyer. And so I would kind of sneak out during my long work days and go to the different cultural institutions in New York, thinking about different possibilities, thinking about different paths. I would take graduate classes. And one of the places I used to like to go was the Morgan Library, which is really one of the most striking, beautiful libraries. It's crimson and gold, has Renaissance masterpiece on the wall. It's kept in the condition as it was when J.P. Morgan still ran it. I was there one day and a docent, excuse me, happened to mention Bell to me. And I just thought it was remarkable. I mean, here we are, early 1900s at a time when women didn't even have the right to vote, and J.P. Morgan hires a woman to run the place. And so she was on my list, right? I think I mentioned I keep a long list of interesting women, and I kind of dipped into her story a little bit over time. There wasn't very much known. As time went on and we got into the early 2000s, her real identity became known. It wasn't known when I first came across her, and that is that she was a Black woman passing as white. That she actually came from this amazing heritage. Her father, Richard G. Greener, was the first Black graduate of Harvard, a first Black professor at the University of South Carolina, one of the best known advocates for equality during his lifetime. And she had to hide all that because Belle lived in an era of segregation, in response to Reconstruction, where Jim Crow had really reared its head. And here she was running an institution that she might not have even been allowed in if people knew who she was. So when this kind of came to the forefront, right, it really solidified in, I think, 2007 or 8, when Heidi Artizzoni wrote the only biography of Belle DeCosta Green. I knew at that time, as much as I wanted to tell her story, Belle deserved to have a Black woman tell her story too. Belle had it hidden in the shadows for her whole life. She burned all of her letters, everything personal about her, so no one would find out her identity. And, I can imagine a lot of things as a writer of fiction, but I cannot imagine what it would be like to be a Black person in our society. So I had been thinking about it for a while, and I happened to read a book that Victoria wrote called Stand Your Ground, which looks at the terrible problem in our country of the shooting of young Black men. And it looks at it from the perspective of the mothers of the mother of the young Black boy and the wife of the white police officer. And it wasn't historical fiction. It was taking a very modern day issue and looking at it from the perspective of the women and looking at it from a variety of cultural perspectives. And I just thought, I wonder if she'd ever consider, delving into Belle DeCosta Green with me. So I reached out to her through our agents. I mean, I didn't even know her, looking back on it, I'm like, how lucky did I get? Because she not only agreed, but we have such a close friendship and sisterhood. Writing a book about race during a time period when there's such racial unrest in our country, it requires us to have such frank and honest conversations that really people don't often have. And so, now we have lots of other books coming out too.
What can you tell us about the First Ladies, the next co-writing adventure you two have coming out together?
And we have a book coming out on June 27th. It's called The First Ladies, and it's about the friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt, who we all know, and someone that we don't know as well as we should, at least not in the white community. Her name is Mary McLeod Bethune. She was the 15th child born in a family, the first born free. And she was incredibly well educated, started a college in Florida, but better known probably during her lifetime for all the work she did as an advocate for equality. In the 1920s, she and Eleanor Roosevelt became friends and then became like best friends. And as they became closer, these two women worked behind the scenes on so many things related to civil rights that we have no idea they are responsible for. So their legacy is just so huge. But, their story for Victoria and I, white and a Black woman who have had to have so many difficult conversations about race and forge such a tight bond in the way that we kind of imagine Mary and Eleanor must have had to do. It's a little bit autobiographical too. So we had, a lot of fun, but also it was just really a labor of love to write that story.
People magazine sang the praises of the fascinating fictionalized account you painted here with Miss Winston Churchill in the pages of Lady Clementine, who the Christian Science Monitor reminded readers was a trusted confidant of her high-profile husband, England's World War II era leader Winston Churchill. What did you feel was underappreciated in the indisputable historical importance she played in her husband's ultimately triumphant tenure as Britain's Prime Minister?
I came across the lack of Clementine when I was researching The Only Woman in the Room. I was looking at World War II, the rise really of World War II from a European perspective, which is very, very different than the American perspective of the rise of World War II. We were kind of like hands off, didn't want anything to do with being involved in the Second War. And if you're looking at Europe from that time period, of course, you're going to see Winston. He's going to be in every news article because he was one of the only ones kind of sounding the bell of the danger of the Nazis and their plans, right? Everyone else was like pro-appeasement, especially in Great Britain. And so as I kind of kept on coming across him, which of course, I mean, everyone knows Winston Churchill, I couldn't help but wonder, where was his wife? Like, I knew that he was married. I knew he'd been married for many decades, just as sort of like a common piece of information. But I just kept wondering, like, there's so many iconic pictures of him. You never see her in them. And so I just started to poke around. Again, as I said to you earlier, it's very often in the absence of a woman or in the very kind of cursory mention of her that there's a good story. And when I went down that particular rabbit hole, I learned that she was not like the woman behind the man. I hate that phrase, but as you said earlier, giving him a cup of coffee, making sure he was ready for his big decisions. She was really right there every step of the way. Like World War I, people don't really realize, like, he was a huge political figure as early as World War I, all the way through World War II. And in the years after, she was like right at his side. I mean, just like from a physical emblematic perspective, if you go to the wartime bunkers in London, which are still very much intact and look exactly as they did during the war, Clementine has her own room right next to Winston's room, right? Because he wanted her there to talk through ideas, to review speeches. She wasn't, a particularly academically trained political figure, but I do think she had a natural savvy. And she also knew that Winston could be his own worst enemy, And I think, that role that she played, it was almost like if we could just expand the photographic lens a little wider, and each one of those iconic pictures, Clementine was almost always present. There she was. And so that was just very interesting to me.
The New York Journal of Books remarked at the end of reading her hidden genius that one can only hope that Marie Benedict will continue to honor hidden women with her beautifully crafted and carefully researched historical novels that bring them to light. Traveling back to the beginning of your intrigue with the life of Rosalind Franklin, who discovered the double helix in DNA, and whose story is told here, the Washington Post wrote, brings to life Franklin's grit and spirit, and an important contribution to the historical record.
Rosalind Franklin, she was a brilliant British scientist who discovered the double helix structure of DNA through multiple years of painstaking work using a really rarefied technique called X-ray crystallography. And that work was taken without her knowledge or permission and used by two men that we know, Francis Crick and James Watson, who won the Nobel Prize for the double helix structure of DNA on the backs of her research.
They stole it from her.
I mean, if you're going to put it that way, sure. Yeah, they did. I mean, they took it and they used it. I mean, some people would say, oh, well, her colleague gave it to them. That doesn't matter. Here's a woman who literally, she sacrificed her life for that work. The exposure of her body to this intense X-ray radiation to get the images that revealed the double helix structure, and then to do all the complicated calculations that reinforce the structure. She got ovarian cancer from that, I think. I mean, it's, we can't know for absolute sure, but there certainly seems to be, a connection, and died a young death. And these men, they used it. These were men who had been forbidden by their boss to work at their lab, to work on the structure of DNA. got the information from Rosalind's colleague, used it, built a model within several weeks, and then they got all the all the fame and fortune.
Now, the Medford sisters were an interesting bunch, to say the least, 6 in all, with Pam, Diana, Unity, Nancy, Jessica, and Deborah, the latter 3 of whom became authors in their own right, but others who followed less pure paths, including Diana and Unity, who became a member of Adolf Hitler's inner circle. And within this sibling ring, you created what Town and Country celebrated as a fun, compelling, and deliciously mannered saga. I have to imagine writing this nearly 400-page opus would be one unto itself.
So I've written about 2 writers, Nancy and obviously Agatha. I think one of the things that's interesting of writing about a writer, and this is true of both of these women, is that, I went back and read or reread, in the case of Agatha, all their books as I wrote their stories. And it's amazing how often writers put themselves, not necessarily their own character, but bits and pieces of their lives and the issues with which they're struggling in those books. And so for me, as a writer myself, I could see, I think, what these women were grappling with, what they were struggling with, a little bit about the way they thought, even when they're writing about a different character, someone so different from themselves. So that was really fascinating. And in the case of Nancy Mitford, during the course of this book, she wrote 2 books which are directly related to the issues that she was struggling with, and I think ways that she was trying to effectuate some change, open some eyes. So what are those about? So the Medford Affairs actually tells the story of 3 of the 6 Medford sisters, who were these brilliant, beautiful, eccentric, aristocratic it girls in the 1920s and 30s. They were raised in these crumbling estates like a pack of feral cats in the British countryside. Parents didn't believe in formal education, but they were all super smart and they were pitted against each other. It was a nutty upbringing. I chose these 3 sisters because 2 of them, Unity and Diana, get wrapped up, or choose to become wrapped up, is probably a better way to put it, in extreme political movements that were on the rise during this time period. Diana leaves her husband and becomes obsessed with Sir Oswald Mosley, who's the head of the British Union of Fascists. And not to be outdone by her sister, Unity, who has always claimed herself to be a fascist, decides she's going to be part of the first lady of Nazism. And she literally stalks, as a teenager, Adolf Hitler and becomes part of his inner circle. And these 2 women are poised with their access. And I forgot to mention, their cousin is Winston Churchill. I mean, I was aware of the Medford sisters from way in college, from some of Nancy's novels that really describe their kind of crazy upbringing. But I learned more about the Mitfords from my research on Clementine Churchill. I kept coming across the Mitfords, and Clementine Churchill was first cousins with the Medford sisters' father, or perhaps more. It is quite possible that Clementine's mother had an affair with her sister's husband, David Mitford's father, and that Clementine and her siblings are actually siblings of David Mitford. It's very complicated. We don't know for sure. So in any event, I came across the Mitfords a lot. So you have these 3 sisters who are literally at the epicenter of the rise of World War II. Unity Mitford is the British person with the greatest access to Adolf Hitler. She is in his presence with his generals and such hundreds of times. And her cousin is Winston Churchill. The damage that they did or could have effectuated was real. It was really real, especially because Diana was with Hitler, with her sister, was furthering the goals of British fascism. When we think about this time period, we think of fascism as being like a continental European thing. I don't, kind of going back to that question of viewing the past through our own eyes and kind of having to peel that away. And when we look at the rise of World War II we don't realize, at least I didn't realize, how prominent fascism and even communism were in Great Britain and how they had footholds. Those weren't things that were just on the continent. And Diana Mitford's ultimate husband, Oswald Mosley, he was at the forefront of that. And he was forging alliances with Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler with his wife's help. And Nancy Mitford is kind of a little bit closer to us in viewpoint. She's a writer, an observer, and she sees what's happening. And she first utilizes her books as tools to open her sister's eyes, open her family's eyes, the world around her. And when people are clinging to appeasement or in some ways clinging to fascism, she's really faced with the question of what more will she do? Where will her loyalties lie? And it's a little piece of history that could, in many ways, have been catastrophic.
Beyond this newest release, your busy imagination has been working overtime as you have yet another new solo novel to tell viewers and fans about, hitting store shelves soon with an all her splendor. Finally, after following in your own path of interest successfully as a best-selling author, what do you recommend to others seeking to do the same?
I would say, this is true no matter what your interest is as a writer, but to follow your passions. I think if your passion is truly your passion is to excavate these, like I do, these women from the past and tell their stories, go for it. But pick a time period, pick a woman, pick a subject matter that speaks to you, not just because you think it's a story that's going to sell. For me personally, I go where the women take me. I am not a scientist, but I've written about 3 scientists, because that spoke to me specifically. And I think following the women and following your passion as a woman writer is so important. There is room for every kind of story out there. There's a reader for every book. But you yourself should be writing something that you want to write and that you want to read. Otherwise it's not your calling specifically. So I think that's would be the best advice I have. Because for me, I look back at my own career, because we've talked about some books that I haven't talked about for a while today. My first 7 books, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to write those. I felt very lucky, but that wasn't what I was supposed to be writing. It took me those 7 books to get to what I was really meant to do. And I think, all of us go through that. It's a journey to find what our purpose is and what we're called to do. So I think listening to yourself and being true to yourself, even if it's not what seems to be on the shelves, maybe it needs to be on the shelves.
Heather, it's been wonderful talking today. Thank you so much for taking our time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you